Our guest this afternoon, his music, I'm sure you're all familiar with in one capacity or another, whether you realize it or not. He was a session player on countless recordings and a key player in the development of a little record label known as Motown back in the day. He also has done a number of solo recordings, which if you're not familiar with, you may have heard sampled by some of your favorite hip-hop artists. And he also has done numerous productions that were quite popular in certain clubs during the disco era. So please, let's give a warm welcome for Mr. Dennis Coffey.
How you doing? Nice to be here. Great crowd so far.
So before we get going, Dennis, we heard a little bit in the background of some stuff you've done in some of the clubs recently, but I want to just give a very quick introduction to something you did back in the day. So it goes a little something like this.
There you go.
So that's one of your solo recordings. But before you were a soloist, you were doing session work, and you actually started at quite a young age. Is that correct?
Yes. Also, Chuck D was here last week, and he used a sample off of that, Getting It On track, without my knowledge, of course. So I'm sitting in the studio, and I'm saying, let me hear what's going on. And all of a sudden, I hear this track, and I said, I don't remember getting paid for that session. So he and I had a talk at the R&B Foundation Gala in Philadelphia about 4 weeks ago, because that's the first time I had a chance to talk to him. And he says, we didn't get paid either. I said, well, okay. He says, I thought you guys would sue the company and get us some money. So that was a story with the first time I heard myself being sampled.
Right. But your roots are obviously predate that. I guess if we could just go back maybe and tell us how you got started, playing the guitar. You're from Detroit, is that correct?
From Detroit, and I had a couple of cousins in the Upper Peninsula that were of Michigan that were playing guitars, and they showed me some chords, and I just was fascinated with the guitar. And my mom told me I could name every song on the radio when I was 3, so I just somehow had a real affinity for music. And they taught me some chords, and I started practicing, and I used to practice in the summer when I was going to school 8 hours a day. And then I ended up contracting and playing on my first session when I was 15. I got some of my friends in high school, and then I had to get one guy who could drive because we weren't old enough to drive to the session. So it was great. I heard myself on the radio at 15, took a couple of solos, and I was hooked from then on. So I just kept practicing, and I can still consider myself a student of music, man. It's still out there, and every day I try and do something different, and I still love it.
Right, but when you started, that was basically in the 50s, and when you were a teenager, and that was the birth of the rock and roll era, really, and
I was in the middle of it. So
yeah.
As things were evolving and the music was evolving, the crowd that I hung around with in Detroit, we were playing teen clubs, and we were working 2 nights a week and getting paid. 16, 17 years old, we were doing gigs already.
Describe, I guess, that whole scene. Before you could actually be old enough to get into the bars and start doing gigs, you left to join the military. Is that correct?
What I did is I wasn't old enough to go from the teen clubs to the bars. I wasn't old enough, so I volunteered for the draft and spent a couple of years in the paratroopers jumping out of airplanes, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but I'm not so sure it was. And I was doing gigs at the same time at night, and I almost got court-martialed because they were all lined up for maneuvers one day, and I pulled up in a cab with my guitar and stuff, so I almost got court-martialed, so I had to join another unit where I could play at night while I was still in the service. So I was recording with Maurice Williams down in South Carolina while I was still in the service.
Right. So once you got out of the service, you went back to Detroit. You were playing, at clubs and things like that. Just sort of set the scene of what the whole environment was like. Detroit being a city where the auto industry was based, and a working class city, a blue collar city, and how did people, sort of cut loose after they had been working in the plants all day?
Well, Detroit still is a music town. I still play one night a month there at Baker's Keyboard Lounge, which is a jazz club that's been in existence for 74 years. Also, I heard someone talk about planning. We never rehearse, we never plan. I give them a couple of chord sheets and count it off, and we're running with it, which means that every time we play stuff, it's different, and that's a good thing for me. But the city itself, when I got out of the service, I was out of the Army 2 weeks, auditioned for a band gig, got the gig, and I was working 6 nights a week from that point on. So Detroit at that time had a lot of bars, had a lot of music, and a lot of people supported the music. Right now, the city's going through some economic woes, but you can still hear live music all over the city. It's just always been a great place to learn how to play, get your chops together, and the people like it. So you can still go out and hear live music all the time.
And still a lot of young musicians, too, coming up, you mentioned. Right?
Absolutely. I have some young cats in my band. They're in their 20s and 30s, and we have fun. We work out and play some tunes, and we have a good time.
So who were some of the young musicians back in the 60s who you would see around in the performing in bars, singers and musicians and whatnot?
There was a whole thing. The one guy that was with me in the Funk Brothers is Bob Babbitt, the bass player. And he and I used to do all the early 60s stuff and the Golden World stuff and do Motown stuff. We used to play in clubs together back in those days also. So there were just different musicians. Bob Seger, of course, came up through the ranks playing at a young age, and different kind of musicians. Plus, you had the whole soul thing going on there, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, before, we jump ahead too much, but explain, I guess, the whole soul scene in Detroit at that time. You met on one of your early sessions somebody who had a little something to do with Motown Records, and I guess just sort of describe what that whole environment was like, because it was kind of coming up at that time.
Well, I was 16, and I had a partner who was 16, and we were doing rockabilly stuff. He did like an Elvis thing. So we wrote this song called Crazy Little Satellite, and we cut a demo at Fortune Records. Somehow Jackie Wilson's manager, Nat Tarnapple, heard that demo. So I found myself in the studio at 16 actually trying to be an artist with my partner, and Barry Gordy was the arranger. This was even before Motown. So we cut the song, it didn't come out, and in about 6 months we just got impatient and we demanded our contract back, and that's the end of it. I don't know what happened to that record.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But in the wake of Motown starting, Barry Gordy being the founder of Motown, I guess in addition to Motown doing its thing, there were a lot of labels and studios popping up in Detroit that were trying to sort of ride that wave of popularity, right?
You had almost, it seemed at times, a little studio on every corner. You had studios in the back of record shops. They were all over the place, and we were doing sessions one after another. We were getting paid cash. Life was good. I mean, we were working all the time, just making records.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, what was your ambition at that point? Was it still to be a performer on your own, a soloist, or work with a group, or were you just sort of just playing the guitar, night to night, just sort of seeing what was coming to you?
I always liked to practice, and I like to write songs. And one day I woke up and I said, people are actually paying me to play music. And I used to do gigs for nothing in the beginning because that was kind of, the lights went on, and I said, well, this is great. I actually get paid for this. So it kind of just kept going. I never got up one day and said, I want to be a musician and make a living at it, because I never really thought that would happen. So as it started happening, I just got busier and busier. In Detroit, a recording session is usually 3 hours, and we had to walk in at Motown or Golden World or wherever. They'd put up some sheet music, and you had to play that song in that hour, read the chart, come up with some ideas, and make it a hit. So we had to do one song an hour. There were 3 hours a session. I used to do 18 sessions a week, so you could figure out I was creating and involved in about 50 songs every week for a long period of time. And I could look on the charts, the Billboard charts, and for 1 year solid, I was on at least 10 songs in the top 100 and at least 3 in the top 10 for a year straight. So we were very busy.
So explain what Golden World was.
Golden World was a studio on Davison, and Ed Wingate started a studio, and we were never quite sure where he got the money, but I think he had a numbers running business under the table, because he seemed to, every so often, when he had his distribution problems, he would send out a couple of his guys, and they always got paid. And Ed always seemed to have a lot of money, so That was the Golden World era. We used to record there all the time with J.J. Barnes and Edwin Starr and all the different acts there.
These are all soul singers.
All soul singers.
And that was before you got down with Motown. You were doing stuff with Golden World?
Golden World, and then there were a lot of different labels. We were doing things also with, we did a thing with the Parliaments with George Clinton, I Want to Testify. We did that kind of stuff, and Open the Door to Your Heart with Darryl Banks and Betty LaVette, all kinds of things that were happening even before Golden World and after in Motown, because there was always different sessions going on.
Right, and these are all 60s soul records made in Detroit.
Yes.
With a Motown type of feel. Actually, so later on you realized that some of the sessions you did were on particularly obscure songs, but had sort of found a whole new audience with the Northern Soul scene.
The Northern Soul scene, when I was put out a book over in Europe called Guitars, Bars, and Motown Superstars. I went over there for 9 days, and people were coming up to me that seemed to remember or had written down more details of the session that I couldn't even remember all those details. And they were coming up with, it seemed like, mint copies of records that I had done in the 60s. I didn't have copies of them. So they were avid collectors, and they knew their stuff. They knew their music.
Does everybody know what Northern Soul is? No, not everybody. Northern Soul is basically records that sound like Motown records that were made at the same time, but they weren't commercial successes. So they kind of faded into obscurity. But in the early 70s in the north of England, soul collectors and DJs found these records and championed them and played them basically at all-nighters, as they're known, which were basically parties that went all night. And they would, as you might guess, and it kind of, in a funny way, predates the whole sort of rave culture and club culture that came afterwards. But you played on a bunch of those records and were surprised to find out that they were actually very popular with people, even though they were nobodies in terms of the success.
Yes, I played on the records, and then I went to a couple of the soul clubs there that were playing it. Then I did a weekend at a resort called Cleethorpes, where I rehearsed with a band in London, and we did, I was opening act for the Velvelettes, and I was at one of those things, and they're like maniacs. I mean, they party all night, and they dance to this music. It was great.
So then at that time, you being a session player in Detroit, really getting down with Motown was something everybody wanted to do, isn't that correct, as a session musician?
I think that was the epitome of the best band in the world, the Funk Brothers, so everybody realized that. My opinion of it was that I probably wouldn't have a chance getting over there, so I never bothered with it. So one day I got a phone call from James Jamerson, the bass player, and he introduced me to Hank Crosby, which is Stevie Wonder's producer. And they said they were doing this producer's workshop upstairs at Golden World, because by then Motown had purchased Golden World. And they said they wanted me to be part of the rhythm section. We were going to provide a place for the producers to get some of their ideas and have a little more time as opposed to the studio time.
Because it was so rushed in the studio, you mean, as far as getting stuff accomplished or whatnot?
Maybe to them, it wasn't for us because we were used to it, but maybe some of the people who maybe didn't have a hit, maybe someone was saying to them, why don't you have a hit? So we started 2.5 hours a night, 4 nights a week, and within a few weeks, Norman Whitfield, the producer, came in with this song called Cloud 9, and by that time I was playing funk in the clubs, and I had wah-wah pedals and distortion and all the effects. So I pulled out the wah-wah pedal and played it on the front of Cloud 9. Within 2 weeks I was in the studio recording it, and all that effect stuff on all the Temptations records is me doing all that stuff. Okay,
so that was your very first session at Motown, was the
Yes.
song Cloud 9. So let's hear a little bit of that.
Thank you. That was the Funk Brothers. You don't get any better than that. I can't even count how many millions of records we sold over at that place. So that was the Cats, man. In that room, we all did that at the same time. That whole rhythm section was all playing together. And that was really about as good as it gets in my mind, anyway.
And on that session too, that was kind of a change of pace. Well, really a change of pace in a lot of ways, not only for the style of the music, but which was a lot funkier than Motown was doing, but also the drummers on that. Can you explain a little bit what's going on there?
That was one of the first sessions. At the workshop, we had a drummer called Spider Webb. He came up with that cymbal figure. The regular drummers at Motown, the first drummer was Benny Benjamin, but by the time I got there, there was Uriel Jones and Pistol. So on that first session, it was Spiderweb doing the cymbal part, and I'm not sure if it was Uriel or Pistol doing the backbeat in the foot. But from then on, most of the sessions that I was doing with the Temptations, one drummer would play the fancy hi-hat stuff, and the other drummer would play the kick drum and play the snare. So that's how you got that powerhouse. And then you had Eddie Bongo Brown on congas, so you had the polyrhythm thing, and Jack Ashford doing the high-end tambourine. Then you got Jamerson doing that funky bottom. Then you got Earl Van Dyke laying them big fat chords. And then we had an organ player, Johnny Griffith. And then we had myself and usually like Eddie Willis, you know, from Mississippi, man, playing those little funky things while I'm doing psychedelic. And then we had either Robert White on guitar or Joe Messina playing that backbeat. Joe Messina would do the backbeat. He had a Fender. But that whole thing together was all done, those rhythm sections were all cut at the same time. So we kind of played off of each other. And the track itself was better than any one of us because it was collectively us jamming together, so it was great.
Now, what about the wah-wah on that? Talk a little bit about, because really before this, the Temptations had been pretty much doing straight Motown type of stuff, you know, more the classic Motown sound, but this was really like more influenced by Sly Stone and you know, a lot more funky stuff. So,
I think the producer, Norman Whitfield, was listening to the psychedelic sound, Sly and the Stone, and the different groups like that, and probably the English groups. He wanted to take the Motown in a different direction. It was a protest time in Detroit. We had the riots. I mean, we were playing in the studio, and someone came in and said someone just firebombed a drugstore down the street, so it's in flames. So we got one person watching the flames come to the studio while we're trying to finish up the record date, and got her done, took the tapes and left. But it was things were very tense in those days, and Norman brought that to the music because Motown was, you know, the love songs. So he brought the protest element to it, and to make that happen, he saw me as a person that could help him get there with the distortion pedals and the funk and the wah-wah stuff and the echoplex and all that kind of texture that could add to what he was trying to achieve.
do you want to give us a little demo of what sort of stuff? Because Norman said
Sure.
to you when he didn't have the idea of doing the wah-wah, to adding that element to the song. He just sort of had you do your own thing, right?
Kind of made up stuff as we went. So Norman would say, "Let me see your bag of toys today. What do you got?" And I'd pull out all these pedals and go crazy. He says, "I love that one," and we'd be off and running. That's how it worked.
You forget the mic. So I'm curious to know, like, you as a session player, you know, both during these years and later, you know, how much of it was an assembly line type of tunnel vision mentality of what you were playing and focusing on, and how much were you aware of the songs you were actually playing and what kind of impact they might make?
What we really did is Motown would have a master rhythm chart, and they'd have 3 different lines. They'd have the piano part, the bass part, and maybe a third part in there. And the rhythm section would all get the same chart. And what we would do is play the chart, but my job was maybe like, you can hear that intro in Just My Imagination. That's something I made up. And then at the end, you'd hear maybe a solo or a figure. I'd make that stuff up. We also got very good at playing fill-ins, but we played them on the offbeat so we wouldn't interfere with the singer, because we had no idea what the singers were going to be singing. So we got very good at doing tracks, noodling little fill-in parts that wouldn't interfere with the voices and wouldn't overpower anyone, and that's how we did it.
Okay. So, but you had no idea what track you were doing for what singer, really, at that time?
Sometimes they had the name of the track on there. Sometimes they had the artist. Sometimes they didn't. But we never heard it until they came in. I know when I did Still Waters Run Deep with the Four Tops, the groove sounded backwards to me when we played it. But once it was a finished record, it sounded great. It ended up being a hit, but we didn't know that at the time.
Is there something else from this Temptations era you want to throw on to give another example? Or? All right.
This is the intro with the Echoplex and the fuzz.
Ball of Confusion. Temptations.
Thank you.
So now, with Motown and the players at Motown, you were not exclusive to Motown, but others were, right?
Yeah, most of the Funk Brothers were signed to Motown, and they could not work for anybody else. And I remember doing a session with the Funk Brothers, 4 o'clock a.m. on a Sunday morning at United Sound, and it's raining out, it's cold out, it's dark, and there's a knock on the back door, and we thought it was a musician. We opened it up, and it was Ralph Seltzer, Barry's Hatchet Man. He showed up, and he runs in, and he points at Eddie Willis, and he points at Jamerson, and he says, "I see you," and he ran back out the door. So they got fined over that, but they couldn't do anything to me.
So the Funk Brothers, the guys who were the session musicians that were under contract to Motown, if they got caught, they got fined doing outside sessions.
And on a rare occasion, sometimes they got fired for a short time.
Right. But you managed to avoid that.
I was always consider myself a free agent. I almost became signed at Motown as an artist. I did a record called It's Your Thing. I gave a copy of it to Clarence Avant of Sussex Records. I gave a copy of it to Hank Cosby to give to Barry. And within about a month, I had a signed contract for an album with Sussex Records as an artist. And then Hank Cosby came up to me in the studio. He says, "Well, Barry loves that song. He wants to sign you." I says, "Well, it's too late. I already signed." So that was the deal.
Okay, so at that point, you're doing stuff with Sussex, right?
Yes.
And when you managed to put together some sessions on your own, you were working with Mike Theodore at that point?
My partner was Mike Theodore, and I was playing in a club, a jazz club, 3-4 nights a week after I was doing all the sessions with the Lima Woodard group.
And who was Mike?
Mike Theodore, we ran into one another at Golden World, and he was an arranger, I was an arranger, and we both, how we learned how to produce, is a friend of ours owned Terra Sherma Studio, and he gave us keys to the studio because Mike Theodore was engineering and I was doing the production arranging, and we'd bring in these bands from the clubs that we knew and we'd record them like 3 o'clock in the morning when the studio wasn't busy, and that's how we learned how to produce, doing bands like that. One of the first groups we did was Rare Earth. We did an album on them for MGM, and that was the beginning. And then when I first met Mike, he had this, Don Mancha had this, Steve Mancha had this session with Scepter, and he wanted Mike to do the charts. And so Mike had this big budget to do horns and strings, and I had done my first string day with the Holidays the week before. So he says, "I noticed you do violins, I do horns, and you can do rhythm. I've never done strings, so let's partner up on this arrangement." And I said, well, to myself, I said, "I've done them once, that makes me an expert." So away we went.
Right. So then how'd you get from doing the productions for other people with Mike to doing your own solo recordings?
Well, we signed up with Clarence Avant as house producers for Sussex, and we did
Sussex
A&R.
Sussex
Records
is a label that
was a label.
Yeah.
And what happened was I took the Lyman Woodard Trio in and did an album for MGM because Clarence okayed it once he heard the demo. And that album was the first album I did, but halfway through, they didn't promote the album because the label that MGM had went under that Clarence had, so I didn't get any promotion on that particular product. So Clarence came back after that thing crashed and burned and said, I got a new label, Sussex, and he gave me a deal to cut the Scorpio album, the Evolution album.
Okay, so you put this solo album out. What happened?
Well, the first year, nothing. So I said, this is great, you know, trying to get something going, and nothing happened. So I did another album. The first album was a guitar band. I used the Funk Brothers, and then I wrote out horn parts for guitars. And I brought in Ray Manette from Rare Earth, myself, and Joe Podorczyk, and we played the leads in sections. I have 9 guitars playing the melody to Scorpio. So in a year, nothing happened, so I did another album called Going For Myself and used horns and strings instead. And then, before that album could be released, Ron Mosley, the national promo guy in New York, called me on the phone. He says, man, I'm going to all the clubs and they're going crazy over Scorpio. He says, it's tearing the roof off. So he said, we're going to stop this album and we're going to resurface Scorpio. And then I remember in Detroit, I was sitting in a bar with Mike and the record was 13. And next week we're listening. I ran out to the car to listen, and that thing going up the charts, 0, nothing, didn't. I thought it fell off again. It went from 13 to #1 in 1 week.
Okay, so this was a year after, what amount of time after you put the album out and you thought it was dead in the water? And
Yeah, it sat there and did nothing for a year.
Okay, so this is what revived that album.
Thank you. You could hear all the guys yelling in the background. That's Jack Ashford and Bongo Eddie. They always got crazy, so I left the mics on, and Theodore says, we got to keep this, so we left it in.
Now, you said before we played the song that you wrote the guitar parts as horn parts, basically.
Yeah, Mike and I were doing a lot of horn and string arrangements with the rhythm section, and we were getting so jaded that we'd look in the union book and we'd find some instrument, and if someone knew how to play it, we'd call them for the session and bring them down and use it.
So that's basically, you know, in case, you know, it didn't register before, that's basically 9 different
9 guitars doing the melody, then I did a baritone sax part through my wah-wah through a bass to add that other piece to it, so it's like a guitar orchestra.
So you get that kind of wall of sound with the melody.
Yes.
So now you weren't able to recreate that live though when you went and toured to support the
Too
song.
expensive. It's, you know, you try and fly all those folks around the country unless you're one of the big superstars. No one's going to pay you to do that.
But that song was still pretty huge for you. So.
Yeah, it was over a million seller, and people still want to hear it today, so we still do it in the club, but we don't do it like the record. We change it every time we do it and just get wild with it. So,
I guess, you know, the breakdowns in a lot of these tracks from your solo period, the beginning of your solo period, you know, is kind of what has sustained it, made it, you know, be appreciated by a whole new audience. I mean, these records are, obviously they were sampled later in the 80s, in the late 80s and 90s, but they were also played at hip-hop park jams in the Bronx, you know, by DJs, just spinning back the breakdowns.
I think that's what broke Scorpio, especially that breakdown. And a lot of my records, I had guitars out in the open. They could grab it and sample it, and then they could loop it, make other records around it. And the first time I went to New York, I think it was in this big hotel in Brooklyn. Now, I'm not saying this place was real rough, but we went in the place, and I asked the owner, the guy that was the manager of the hotel, I says, well, where do we park? Where's your parking lot guy? He says, well, tell you the truth, my parking lot guy had his head shot off last night with a shotgun, so we don't have one. So he said, drive around to the parking lot. He says, back your truck up against the wall and take the distributor cap off and chain down your steering wheel, and you'll be okay. So anyways, we're playing in this big ballroom. It's 2,000 people in there. The place is jammed, and we do Scorpio. And I looked up during the percussion break, and there's like 2,000 people in a conga line just coming towards the bandstand. It freaked me out. It was just wild.
Okay, around this time, so you're doing the solo records. You're on Sussex. Early 70s, 73. You're not doing Motown sessions at this point, or are you?
I'm working out at Mo West. I mean, why not? You know, they were paying me scale and a half, and I still worked for, did the Motown stuff, and I worked with Ringo Starr, Quincy Jones, Tom Jones, everybody out there and the SWAT TV show and in concert, all the stuff that LA had to offer. So that
Well, let's
worked out pretty
backtrack. So you decide to leave Detroit and move to LA. And what was the motivation exactly?
Things were getting slow in Detroit, and I wanted to move to an area that had more action because I thought the Motown thing was slowing down, and there weren't a lot of labels like there used to be in Detroit. So I wanted to move to LA and see what kind of opportunities were out there. And I wanted to do a film. I thought that was a big deal. So when I got there, I told Clarence Avant to see if he could find me a deal to do a film. And I was sitting out there for about 2 months and I didn't hear anything, so I figured, okay, I'm falling off the cliff here, we're done. So I get a call from Motown. So I went into the studio at Mo West at 10 o'clock in the morning, and they kept bouncing me up, down, upstairs studio, downstairs studio. So I started at 10 in the morning, and when I finally got done recording all the stuff they had, it was 4 a.m. the next day. That was my first session at Mo West.
That's when Motown opened up their West Coast.
Their West Coast studios,
studios.
Yes.
Okay. But Motown actually left Detroit altogether around that time as well, right?
They had the other studio ready, and then one day the other guys, the Funk Brothers, showed up at the studio. I was already in L.A., and they came to do a session. Here you come. You spent your whole major part of your career for Motown. You show up to do a session, and there's a sign on the door saying, "There will never be any sessions here again. We're closed." That's the word the musicians got, the Funk Brothers, that final day. They went there to do a session thinking they're going to make some money, and there's a sign on the door, "There will be no more sessions here. Motown is closed in Detroit."
That's pretty crazy. What was your reaction from the guys when you stayed in touch with, and how did they cope with that?
I think has anybody seen the Standing in the Shadows of Motown documentary? So that said it all, really. And the guy who did that film, Alan Slutsky, came up to me, and at the rehearsal, they wanted me to do more in the film. And he says, "Let me see your guitar. I'm going to show you how I want you to play it." And I says, oh, okay. So when he called me to do the live part, I said, "Alan, why don't you play it yourself?" And I didn't go. But anyways, you could hear what the guys say, The guys felt bad of what happened. Me, I just couldn't, the guy rubbed me the wrong way at that time anyways. But anyways, you can see in that movie how the guys felt, how they were really kind of let down and what happened to all the guys. And about 4 weeks ago, I was at the R&B Foundation in Philly, and Aretha and Chaka Khan and Jerry Butler and everybody was there, Bonnie Raitt, and they gave myself and Eddie Willis, Bob Babbitt, and Uriel Jones, they gave us Pioneer Funk Brother Awards. So it was real nice, and Dionne Warwick was singing there. It was everybody in R&B were all performing there. So it was just a great kind of a wrap-up to this, the whole career of working with the Funk Brothers.
Now, you mentioned you went out to LA, you wanted to get some TV and soundtrack work, and just as far as Scorpio and that whole era of what the solo stuff you were doing, you tried to do the wall of sound sort of guitar orchestra thing, but when you got a chance to do the some movie work, you also experimented with that as well. So.
Well, I always try and do different things. I think that's the heart of creativity. I always try and write new songs, play different licks, use new effects, whatever, always something new. Because if you don't, it can get boring. You really have to challenge yourself all the time. So what I did is I went and met Jerry Weintraub. He was the one doing this movie, Black Belt Jones, and most of the score was done, but they had no main theme and love theme for it. So I sat down with him, and, other than taking this movie actor, David Jansen, I was in his parking spot, so he got kind of teed off, but that's another story. So anyways, I decided, again, I got to do something different. What can I do different on this film? So I watched part of the film, and I came up with the main theme and the love theme. So I thought, well, this time I'm going to do this. I'm going to I knew the singers in L.A. could sight read. They could read pretty much anything. So I wrote out vocal parts for the melody, and I ran them through my wah-wah pedal through the amp. And then in the middle, I did a breakdown, and I wrote this counterpoint piece of 4 different voice parts working against each other in harmony, almost like a Bach kind of invention. And I put that in the middle, so that's what you hear here with this record, Black Belt Jones.
Okay, and this is set from the film Black Belt Jones. It's a martial arts film.
Yes.
Right, okay. Theme from Black Belt Jones.
There you go. The horn and string parts were written by my partner, Mike Theodore. And you can see again, we had all the LA cats, and it's fun. You can hear in the intensity of the players, man. That's what it's all about for me.
But you never really, besides the Black Belt Jones tracks, you never really tried that again with the voices and the wah-wah?
Well, you know what? I went to the screening of the film, and the sound effects were 10 times louder than my music, so I got ticked off, and I didn't do any more movies. I get stubborn sometimes.
But did you like LA? I mean, how
I was out there for 3 years. I did the film. I was doing TV shows. I played with everybody out there I wanted to play with, and after a while, I decided it was too hectic. I like peace and quiet, so I went back to Detroit.
Okay. Now, what happened when you went back to Detroit? What was the game plan at that point?
What I did is Sussex Records were having financial problems, so I switched companies, and I got a deal with Westbound with Armin Baladian for myself and my partner Mike Theodore. So we moved our operations to Westbound. In 1975, we recorded one of my albums for Westbound, but part of it was done in LA and part of it was done in Detroit, and then we moved our operations to Detroit to support Westbound.
Okay. Now, at this point, it's mid-'70s, you're in Detroit, you're trying to work with Westbound, it's a record label out of Detroit. You said that you were sort of studying what was happening as far as disco and how that was going. What did you do to actually sort of study what was going on and how it was put together?
Well, we were getting pressure from Armin, of course, because he was getting pressure from Atlantic. You know, we got to get some hits. And disco was out there, so, you know, I thought, well, Mike Theodore and I had gone to New York for some of the conventions, the Billboard conventions. So I knew what was happening in the disco market. So I just went out and bought a bunch of disco records, and I pretty much took them apart piece by piece and figured out what made them tick. And then I used that as a foundation, and that's when we created this record called Devil's Gun. And to make this thing happen, of course, we got the disco mix master, the guy Tom Moulton, just was a fantastic guy, and had him do the mix downs on it.
So who was Tom Moulton? What was he known for back then?
Back then, Tom was a DJ, very successful. He was very connected with all the clubs in New York, and he did the mix downs at Sigma Sound in Philadelphia, and we knew that to make this thing happen, not only what we were cutting in Detroit, we needed him to do the mixes for us.
Okay. Now, we don't have Devil's Gun, which was the single that CJ and Company
yes.
did, but I can play another one by the same group.
Okay.
See how, this is by the group CJ and Company. So this is you and Mike Theodore
Produced
yes. and writing as well?
Not writing, arrangements.
Not writing, arrangements. Okay, so let's see if this works. This is CJ and Company, and you may have heard this.
There you go.
You don't hear that much about your work in this era, though. I mean, everybody focuses on the Scorpio era and all that sort of stuff. But, I mean, a lot of these records you did in this era, the disco stuff you and Mike did were really embraced by, David Mancuso at the Loft and other big underground DJs in New York. Nobody really talks about this era, though.
At first it was kind of like the stepchild of the funk era. So people didn't want to recognize it, but they didn't understand. In Detroit, we were using the funk players to do this stuff, and the Bee Gees were using the funk players and Criteria to do this stuff. So it was just a different form of music. And so we were kind of doing things that way. And what happened was, of course, my partner Mike Theodore got very good at doing horns and strings, and the records still hold up. But it's like anything else. When I work at Baker's Keyboard Lounge, the first time I worked there a few times, I did upright bass traditional jazz, and the people, they just gave me blank stares, so I had to bring back the funksters, and we get crazy and funky because that's what people want from me, so that's what I do.
Mm-hmm. Now, this wasn't a good experience, though, for you at Westbound.
I think what happened at Westbound is that they ran out of a deal. We came to talk to Armin Baladian in Atlantic, had cut them loose, so within 2 weeks we were out of work. Boom.
And then you moved to New York at this point?
Yes, we had a couple of independent deals, but the record business was so bad that they would give you $50,000, Columbia did, for us to do a project. We had the project done, and they didn't even put it out. They said, we can't put it out right now because the record companies were going through, that was the beginning of the record business. Started as a small business. It got huge. There was plenty of money to go around. But at that point, there was a lot of competition for the entertainment dollar, and this was the first crack starting to appear in the record business, and this was back in the late 70s, early 80s. It was suddenly not a young business per se. It was starting to age, and there were cracks in the system. So we had 3 deals already paid for with acts, and we had companies that just refused to put the stuff out. And once we got to New York, the labels did a whole change-up. They would say, okay, Mr. Producer, you spend your money, and you go cut a master, and then we'll tell you if we like it. If we don't, you eat the cost. So that's when I stopped being Mr. Producer. I says, you got to be kidding me, man. We're not playing that game.
What about session work? Was there any session work available in New York at that time?
There were a few things, but New York was so jammed up. So I was there a few years and did a few sessions and things, and it just wasn't working out. So I realized it was time to rethink me in the music business. So I came back to Detroit and ended up going to work for one of the car companies.
So you say in your book, you make a very profound point about the thread of life is your livelihood, and once that's taken away from you, it can really leave you very depressed.
Well, what happens is, if there's one thing that I can state to everybody is self-reliance and flexibility. No one's going to cover you. No one's going to give you money for the rest of your life. You have to take care of your own skill and talent, and you have to be flexible. Whatever it takes. I went back and got 2 degrees and got a master's degree, and I was out getting sent all over the country by one of the car companies. And a lot of my buddies in the music business were literally dying because things fell apart. Some of them couldn't cope. And I mean, dying, dead. So it was very tragic. So that's the one thing you have to remember is your skills. Always try and keep your skills going, and you always have to be aware because no one can be creative when they're starving.
But one thing you had to do when you got back to Detroit was just find a way to pay the bills, basically, because things had really, really dried up.
Yeah, I went to work on an assembly line in an automotive company, and they're playing my records on the radio while I'm building cars. Well, what the hell? You got to do something, so you got to be flexible. I mean, if you take it too seriously, it'll kill you. So you just say, okay, I got to find another way to make money now, and you just do it.
So you were on the assembly line. What were you doing? Well, describe the environment of what that was like and what your mentality was at that point.
Well, it kind of sucked. I'm sitting there putting together transmissions, putting in torque converters 3 a minute, and it was probably 120 in the summer, and I was putting in torque
120
converters.
degrees in the summer.
Yeah, so I'm putting in torque converters, building transmissions. So that segued into, they said, we need somebody to be an instructor, and I had taught guitar, so I applied for that job. So I ended up being an instructor and learning a thing called instructional design. So while I was working on the line, I went back and got my bachelor's degree, and then I got a master's degree in instructional technology. And the last 10 years, I was a consultant. Ford Motor was sending me all over the place to consult their plants. And then that was my last experience in regular business. Now I'm just doing music again.
So, but during that time, was music completely absent from your life? How did you play at all? Did you do any gigs? Did you practice? What did you do?
I think in my entire life, the only time I didn't have my hands on a guitar on a regular basis when I was in boot camp for the Army, because they wouldn't let me bring my guitar there. But when I was after boot camp, the first 16 weeks, and after jump school, I had my guitar in my hands in the Army and every part of my life. I play every day, 2 hours a day, and I'm on it, man. It's just what I like to do.
So you were working at Ford after working at GM, and then you got back into the music thing, and you found that doing the live gigs around town was something that could keep you going as well. Besides,
yeah, it worked out good. The first time I did a gig at Baker's Keyboard, I talked to the owner, and he saw me sitting in. He says, okay, so he provided me some musicians. And then I figured out after 3 weeks trying to get a rehearsal, it wasn't going to happen. So I said, okay, fine. So I showed up the day of the job with musicians I hadn't met before. I gave the piano player and bass player a chord sheet. And I says, okay, we're doing this song. And I counted it off, and that was the way we went. And I never rehearsed with anybody since for the Baker's gig. And I've finally gone through many musicians. But one thing about Detroit, if you get good players, it'll work out. And it always has.
So I just sort of a more abstract, broader question. What do you think it is about Detroit as a city that has been able to produce so many different musicians, producers, DJs, et cetera, et cetera?
It's part of the culture. In a culture of a city, sometimes you can try and figure out why. I only figure out that you can go all over the place and still hear live music. Culturally, some of you may or may not have heard that Levi Stubbs passed away with the Four Tops. Why I think that shows you a little bit about the culture is a few years ago, Levi had had a stroke, and I played a show at the Opera House in Detroit. All the major stars showed up, and halfway through the show, they brought Levi out in a wheelchair, and he's singing two verses of a song with Aretha Franklin, and the Four Tops are singing behind him, and Dennis Edwards and the Temps are singing on the other side, and it just brought the house down. But this was a thing where he was their friend, and we were all going to do this, and that's also part of the culture of the city.
I mean, speaking of Rodriguez, you know, in that whole era, and even the Temptations material that Norman Whitfield did, very topical, like you said, very much incorporating that protest sensibility. In the late '60s in Detroit, I mean, there were pretty renowned riots. You mentioned the store getting bombed down the studio, but what other experiences do you remember from that time?
Well, the biggest thing that started it, there was a Blind Pig, which is an after-hours place that's supposed to be licensed that was serving alcohol. And the police department apparently went in and busted it and got heavy-handed with the people, and it was a hot summer night, and the economy wasn't doing good, and there was just a lot of tension, and it just erupted into a riot. And it got so bad that they brought in the National Guard, and they actually brought in my old unit, the 101st Airborne Division. They brought them in. Some of them came back from Vietnam. And how serious it was, when you have the 101st in there, they show it on TV, they had a sniper in a building, and he's shooting at the 101st Airborne Division guys, and they're in a self-propelled gun. And so I saw the captain of the unit, he's got a bullhorn, and he tells the guy to quit firing at him, and you can hear the pings off the self-propelled gun. So then the guy says something, and you see this cannon go right like that and blew off the whole corner of the building with the guy in it. That's how bad that was.
The Motown musicians were black and white players. Was there any sort of carryover in any way as far as camaraderie, of the team?
We were all friends, and I was working in the black clubs anyways, so we were all friends. And Eddie Willis, the guitar player, told me he came home one night after a session with his guitar, and he got stopped in front of his house by a tank. And the tank had the turret pointing at him, and they made him get out of his car, and they says, and Eddie uses a cane over here too, so they got the tank on him, and they asked him what he was doing there, and he says, man, this is my house, I live here. But it was kind of a weird story he told us later on.
Any other questions for Dennis?
Yes.
Russell. Hold on a second, Russ. You can wait for the mic.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, much respect, man.
Thank you.
So what year was that that you put that Wawa on that song?
Boy, I think that was probably 68, maybe.
68.
Yes.
So Hendrix was using the Wawa at that.
Hendrix was using the Wawa, and I think Eric Clapton and some of the folks. So the only thing I did is no R&B record had any Wawa or any of that stuff until I put it on.
Right. So you were the first one to put that in an R&B
Yes.
song.
Yeah.
Cool. Now, do you because there's been some debate on who was the first one to use the Wawa.
Okay.
Do you know anything about the history of that and who might have used it first?
Boy, I sure don't know, other than I can only speak for when I used it.
Right.
And I know in the R&B thing, I was using special effects. Like, you remember a Record in the Rain by the Dramatics?
Yeah.
That Echoplex intro? That's
Yeah.
me doing that. And then What You See Is What You Get. I used a different unit on that. And I used that same unit on Don't Knock My Love and Muscle Shoals of Wilson Pickett. So I was kind of getting around using the sound effects on different things. And Smiling Faces, I used that for the solo in the middle of Smiling Faces. But that was a Condor unit. That was another different effect.
Yeah, see, I had no idea you were responsible for all the sort of psychedelic Motown stuff. That's really
We
cool.
had fun, and Norman Whitfield, unfortunately, he passed away about 3 weeks ago, and he was the guy that wanted to do that. And I was in the BBC came in last Saturday at Baker's, and they're doing a documentary. So we're in there, and Spider Turner's a singer that's in there, and him and Norman were friends. So he's telling me about Norman's illness and all this and how they were staying together for a while. And then Norman was telling him, man, he says, I got to have some fried chicken. And Spider looks at him and says, it's that fried chicken that's got you sick. You ain't getting no more fried chicken. So that was the story about Norman.
All right, last question. Do you remember at that time when you first started working with Motown, how many tracks they had in the studio? Was it just 4-track?
No, I would think probably 8 by then. When we first started producing, Mike Theodore and I, we had 4-track. And we were doing orchestras, full thing. So what we had to do, we record the rhythm tracks, and then we'd bounce the whole rhythm track to 1 track. Then we'd record strings and orchestra, horns and strings, and we'd bounce that to 1 track. And then we would do the lead, and that'd be 1 track. And then we would have the background singers. So with a 4-track, you'd have a full orchestra on one, a full rhythm section on one, and a lead singer on one, and background singers on one. And I'm telling you, you were limited in the mixing when you're trying to do that.
Yeah.
Try and get in a stereo image with just 4 tracks, and you couldn't re-equalize everything much.
Right.
Because certainly you couldn't do the individual instruments. You couldn't re-EQ them because they were all on 1 track.
Yeah, we have like limitless tracks now.
Yeah, it was a big deal when we went from 4 to 8. I thought, man, this is heaven. Then we went to 16. I said, man, we're really living now. Then it went into 24. And then in LA, they were linking 2 24 tracks together. And I did a session that some guys brought in from Motown. And they must have had, I would say they had 24 tracks and nothing but background voices. It was just crazy after that. I said, man, this is taxing my brain. We need to do simple things.
Oh, yeah, and I forget, how old were you when you first did your Motown session?
Oh, geez. I was probably in my late 20s, maybe, because I had already been working with the Volumes and played on hit records with Del Shannon, and I started session stuff when I was 15, so
right.
I was doing that whole thing. So it just segued from Golden World into the Motown thing.
Nice. Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. You know, you folks are the generation. You're the next generation. You got the music future right here. I mean, this is what's going on. The things that you do down the road, you may be sitting up talking to some people like I'm doing. You'll be having this chair, all you folks. I mean, you're the people now that are going to be doing things down the road. The future belongs to you folks. Thank you. Thank you. Need to give you folks an ovation because you're the future. It's great to see everyone here.
Well, thanks for these yet another spontaneous standing O. I guess on that note, yes, thank you, Mr. Dennis Coffey, for your...
Thank you. Let's give Jeff a big hand here for the job he's done.